The Zone Coverage Podcast Network.
You ready?
We're live.
Wolves wired. In Game 4, the Timberwolves gave up 50 points.
Wolves in 7.
Yeah.
we got to keep the theme alive.
So
we'll go Wolves in 8 on Thursday.
There was apparently one guy in the upper bowl chanting Wolves in 7.
I heard about that.
And then at the very, very end of the game,
that was actually me,
there
Tim.
was you and Ricardo?
Yeah, me and Ricardo. For some context, it's me and the foreigners in the top press box. That's it.
I actually don't mind covering, and maybe it's
I kind of liked it too. Actually,
yeah.
The interns too, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
I was the only white person.
All right. So
that's a good start.
The Wolves are now down 3-1 in the first round after a pretty good first half. They kind of gave up some ground at the end of the second quarter, but then in the third quarter they gave up, again, 50 points in a quarter. The Rockets doubled their score in 12 minutes. So I guess my first question is, in that quarter, the quarter that might have kind of sealed their fate in the playoffs, how much of it was Houston finally coming out of their shooting coma, and how much of it was Minnesota's defense breaking down?
Okay, so the first thing I want to touch on, which actually Houston commented on in some of the quotes I've seen from postgame, wasn't even so much the 50 burgers, the fact they only scored 20 points in the quarter. Like, in addition to Houston's offense catching fire and them hitting all of their threes, the Timberwolves also just could not put points together. It was like a 22-4 run to start the second half. Like, they can, like, it's not necessarily that the Timberwolves can't, like, Timberwolves have put up 35, 40 points in a quarter before. If you do that, you're only down 10, 15, even if the Rockets do put up 50 in a quarter. Like, the 50 is absurd. It draws the eyes, but they got beat by 30 in the quarter, which is the much bigger problem in my eyes.
A couple questions for you guys, especially you're there watching probably a little closer than me. First of all, do you think the first half Houston struggling was Houston being off, or do you think Minnesota defended them well and threw them out of their rhythm? To what extent, maybe, is the best way to answer that question?
I would just say it starts, goes to the middle, and finishes with James Harden. And if James Harden comes out and is 0 for 7 in the first quarter, it's going to be a good quarter for the Timberwolves.
I mean, he even out of that timeout in the third quarter, when the crowd was trying to get him back in, shut him off like a light, right? Hit the three, was like, shut up. And
right.
Yeah.
And when Chris Paul starts off 0 of 5 to boot, and he and Harden are just going back and forth in that third, and it's Harden. Harden's the instigator for everything, but when both of them are on, that team's impossible to stop when they're running pick and roll.
Do you think the end of the second quarter, I know it goes into halftime, but leaked into it, like all of a sudden when things were going bad, they're like, oh, we let them back in the second quarter, and it's just a buildup of negative momentum?
I don't I guess really subscribe to that. I think it's a product of the Rockets getting going, and as Tim said, not just Harden. We've been talking about kind of the multifaceted ways that Houston can get going, being isolation, pick and roll game, 3-point shooting, stout defense. And in the fourth quarter, they brought all of those right away in the first 3 or 4 minutes. And that's a really hard punch to take. And probably the reality is that an 8th seeded team, or maybe even a 3 or 4 or 5 seeded team, can't handle that. It's too powerful. What Houston brings, and they haven't really brought that in any of the first 3 games.
Runs like that, I said this to somebody on Twitter last night. Runs like that are Houston and Golden State. These teams of the last couple of years that have been super dominant in the regular season. That's those teams at their peak, is they can just snowball out of control once the shots start falling. And if you can't score with them at all, the game is over. And that's like, it hadn't happened from Houston this series, but we saw them do that so many times in the regular season, including in at least 1 or 2 of the matchups between these teams in the regular season, where Houston just started hitting shots, the Wolves couldn't keep up. This was, Tim and I talked last night, it wasn't the 3 versus 2 math problem, it was the 3 versus 0 math problem.
Yeah, it's hard to win when you don't score. But I mean, so I got into a little engagement with somebody on Twitter about They got mad
Congrats.
when I essentially that
was a dumb joke.
Yeah, it was. That's okay. We make dumb jokes on here. It's what we get paid to do. I essentially said Houston is an elite offense, and they got going finally. And I mean, Minnesota's defense didn't help matters for sure, but when James Harden and Chris Paul are making their shots, it makes it 1,000 times easier for people like Eric Gordon, who also got going in the third quarter, to start hitting their shots, because then they're starting to hover on James Harden and Chris Paul, which is what makes Houston's offense so impossible to guard. It's when they focus in on those two key guys, everybody else gets easier looks.
Because, I don't necessarily think that the defense on Harden was that bad in the fourth quarter. He had some shots that were more open than they should have.
Fourth quarter?
Third quarter.
Okay.
Some shots that were more open than they perhaps should have been, but Wiggins was usually pretty close on some of the jumpers, and they just were going in.
With specifically to Wiggins, and I just noticing the possessions that he's guarded Harden in this series, I think he's the type of player with very, very long wingspan and athleticism that he's defending Harden as if he is defending a normal dynamic isolation scorer, where he has this elite length and athleticism where he thinks that he can kind of play back a little bit more because he has the size and athleticism to close out on the jumper. But Harden's ability to create space with that step back, I mean, Wiggins is not, he didn't effectively contest one of those, and because it's the hardest play to contest. But I think Wiggins was in his head not necessarily diversifying guarding James Harden versus DeMar DeRozan or whatever.
And the other thing was he and I think other Timberwolves defenders were going under screens on both Harden and Paul even after the onslaught started, and that had to change.
And
I think they did a better job of that particular thing in the first half. A much better job. And then in the second half, it fell off a little bit. But again, it's really hard to fully criticize their defense. I mean, it's easy to criticize a defense that gives up 50 points. When you give up 50 points, you're doing something wrong. But with this particular offense, part of it just goes on the Rockets being as good as they are.
Because there's a limit.
This was 50 points wasn't inevitable, but an outburst like this was sort of inevitable, I think.
And Houston's shot chart, they hit, I want to say 9 of 12 or something ridiculous like that from 3. That quarter, they just hit everything.
And there's just a pendulum to Houston, and I think it's been interesting in covering all 4 games of this series is Mike D'Antoni kind of brings up that all the time with, we missed some shots, but we're going to make them. There's going to be a time where we make them.
Yeah.
And really, if we look, and I don't even think you need to look at the stat sheet. You just think about games 1, 2, and 3, and you're like, wow, this Houston team is missing more shots than I remember them missing at any time.
So, that stood out to me that you said after Game 3, D'Antoni was not concerned, kind of was pretty laid back or level-headed. Do you think the team feeds off of that? Because it seems like maybe the message at halftime resonated and Paul and Harden went off when they struggled early, in the first half.
I would just say they're a very confident team. As they should be. They had the best record in the league, but there's an element of you just kind of need to not let yourself vacillate too much mentally. I think with shooting, and that's just a thing for shooters individually, but that team has kind of been this way for a couple of years now.
Yep.
And so I think they've built up I don't know what the word is, but they're okay with, they understand, okay, we shot 43s today and we only made 10. That's not, rather than for some teams they'd be like, well, we can't shoot as many threes next game. They're like, no, we assume that it's going to regress or progress to the mean the next game.
Yeah, that kind of goes to what I was going to say. It's D'Antoni's zen about it. I feel it comes from the fact that Houston's game plan has never really changed. Since this team came together, even before Chris Paul joined this offseason. They have their game plan. They know exactly what they're going out to do. They're going to do it the same way, and they're going to get the shots they're going to get. They'll have nights where they won't go in. They usually won't have 4 out of 7 nights where they won't go in. And that's that's the kind of thing that you see in the playoffs is for a team to beat them in a series, we all walked into the series and knew how bad the matchup was for Minnesota in terms of scoring with Houston, because Houston's going to go out and do what they do. A team has to be able to outscore them at least to some degree 4 out of 7 nights without a night like this happening.
Which is kind of what they did in Game 3. Like when it got ridiculous at the end, that's what they were doing. They were just, everyone was hitting threes, right? I wonder, going back to the point of they have a system in place. Daryl Morey kind of, in my mind, is the Billy Bean of basketball, right? Runs all these stats and has implemented it well. Usually the criticism there is that what happens on paper, if you will, doesn't translate on the court. And once you get the human emotion and just the kind of highs and lows of players.
But they take that out.
Right, and so that's my question. Do you think a more statistically inclined team, like I remember going back to the baseball analogy, Glenn Perkins, who was a very stats-oriented player, would consistently tell people, if I had a bad outing, I knew what I was doing was right, and I looked at the stats and they reassured me that I just had a bad break. Do you think Houston has a similar mentality where they're like, we know our system works, but not only that, it's packed by stats, and therefore not much phases them?
Yeah, and I would say the stat element of it comes from even higher than beyond D'Antoni, and that's a Morey thing. I think why it's working is because I really don't think the players think that much about the numbers or statistics or even D'Antoni. They just have seen that this has worked. They've tried it out enough time over a few years that they've felt their dominance and the power in this way that they play. They know that they can pack this punch through the style of play.
And the flip side that also goes through Morey is they've constructed a team with players whose skill sets fit well within the system that Morey wants to play. They want the shots that are coming out of this system that are the best shots. It just makes, all the pieces make sense.
The other thing D'Antoni has said, and it kind of goes back to his just confidence in the team's system, was throughout the end of the regular season, between resting guys and guys just getting hurt and them clinching the 1 seed, there was sort of a period of sort of a lull where they weren't really taking games as seriously. And he talked about how maybe they just weren't all the way back to where they were when they were at their best in the regular season. And with that in mind, I mean, that's what comes back to that confidence for D'Antoni in the system and the game plan. Taking a quote from Karl Anthony Towns, throughout the series, even when things were bad, it was pretty clear that D'Antoni was going to tell him to keep shooting. And so I think that confidence is kind of a reflection from the coach in a lot of ways. But I don't think the players necessarily look at the statistics in the way like a Glen Perkins.
Yeah, I also kind of looking at it from the Timberwolves perspective. Over and over, we said he's importing his guys to create a culture, right? The Tibbs culture that he kind of had in Chicago. Does this reinforce that you got to have buy-in from Towns and Wiggins in order to have success? Like that, I know he's just starting to implement it, Tibbs, but that they have to buy into the culture and the methods of Tibbs.
Yeah, I mean, Karl Anthony Towns is the story of this playoff series. Houston's done a ton to take him away. Or did at the beginning of the series an adjustment that I don't know if Towns was ready for or expecting in the double teams that we've talked about endlessly. And then they kind of threw another shift at him. They came and went with that sort of bringing the double strategy. They were like, okay.
I thought that was brilliant.
Yeah. And, I mean, Karl Anthony Towns has not responded well in this series. When the double teams were coming, that's not something you can just plow your way through and, go get, but at the same time he didn't execute well. He just this whole series he did not come up to meet the challenge. And I thought particularly in the beginning of the third quarter is when you saw Houston make that adjustment, and they really went away from it, and they had Harden guarding him often, and Towns he continued to trust the pass when this was a time when you didn't need to pass because there wasn't a double team and it was just Harden, and so for him to just be okay with okay, I'm just going to move the ball over to Andrew there is it's very different than what you would expect Joel Embiid to do in that situation. Kristaps Porzingis, Anthony Davis, these other elite bigs that you would see. I mean, they would start drooling if they had James Harden on them in a one-on-one situation.
But even mid-season or late-season Karl Anthony Towns, I feel like is the same way. If he sees James Harden on him, he's going to attack. But I feel like the Rockets got in his head, and he was, when James Harden would have him one-on-one, or I guess vice versa, it felt like he was waiting for the double and was looking around for the double. And instead of attacking, I mean, he'd either go up and take a bad shot or he'd throw the ball back out. It felt like Houston was in his head because mid-season Karl Anthony Towns goes at the little guy every time.
Does this kind of go back to a thing we've questioned before with Towns' decision-making? Like... We talked. This is fresh in my head because we actually talked about it on a different podcast on Sunday this week about the early season struggles with Towns on the defensive end in terms of making the right decisions, making the right plays, being in the right place at the right time. It seems like in this series, his decision making on offense has come into question. Mm-hmm. Just because maybe it's because he's seeing different things than he's used to seeing, which Houston's done a great job of doing as we've seen. But it's one of those things where it's like maybe this is a necessary step in his development in learning how to do this and learning what the right decisions in these situations are.
Well, the catch-all phrase would be basketball IQ.
Yeah.
And I think, maybe it wasn't as apparent during the regular season, a lower basketball IQ on the offensive end, because is so talented in that
skilled,
way, so skilled that you can kind of cover over that. But then you have a team, a top 5 defense in the league that's also specifically scheming against you. That's, that is a play by them to attack his, I don't want to say like low basketball IQ, but not, he certainly doesn't have an above average, basketball IQ. And then at some point you throw in his mental fragility, and this is what we get. Is what he's been through these 4 games,
and it's a new experience for him, right? The level of game planning that goes into playoff basketball like this was Houston's plan, and like players like Towns. Even in his peak days at Kentucky, even in regular season games where he's clearly been the Timberwolves' best player even before Jimmy Butler, he's never had a team game plan specifically to stop everything that he wants to do like this before. And so this is an essential experience for him to take the next step, for him to learn how to deal with this, to become like, look at, say, the New Orleans-Portland series, where Portland, I'm sure, tried to game plan for Anthony Davis, and Anthony Davis made himself ungame planable. Mm-hmm. So that's like, and before, I don't think Davis hasn't been able to be like that game changer in the playoffs like he was in this particular series, partially because of worse matchups. But Towns has to learn that and has to kind of go through this abuse to figure out how can I make myself unstoppable even when an opposing team is throwing everything they have at me.
So how much of that falls on Tom Thibodeau then? Because, for the most part, Towns' sheer talent and skill and athleticism has been able to cover up whatever basketball IQ deficiency, I guess we can call it, he might have had or might have. This is the first time we've really seen it over an extended stretch. Obviously, it's the first playoff series he's ever played against. If everything we just said about Towns is true, isn't it on Tom Thibodeau to then adjust to make Towns a more effective player?
I don't think it's an adjustment you can necessarily make during the playoffs. I think it's fair to believe that Towns and Tibbs haven't necessarily been on the same wavelength for the entirety of the regular season. So maybe to make those adjustments, the requirement is to have become a better connected star and coach.
Sure.
Months and months in the past. Would have it fixed it? Would that make the Wolves win this series? No. But when we're talking about the future and the concerns I know we all have about the future, that's or I'll speak on my behalf, that's where my concerns are. Is I don't see 2 key individuals in this Timberwolves calculation, probably the two most important, having any sort of synergy. And let me finish real quick, is what I feared or thought with Thibodeau at the beginning is that he was just a coach who didn't have that synergy with anyone. He was just like an individual. I do my job.
Fair thought.
and now, seeing him, around the team more this year, is I see him having these relationships with Taj Gibson, with Jimmy Butler, and with Derrick Rose, and having no relationship from my standpoint with Andrew Wiggins or Karl Anthony Towns or
at
Tyus
least,
Jones.
At least less of a relationship.
Yes, undoubtedly less of a relationship, and we're not there all the time, but that's the more big picture concern. I have some belief in Tom Thibodeau, his mind and his basketball IQ, but that's not all what coaching is. That's what an assistant coach is.
Right.
That's what an assistant coach needs, and there's the human element to being a head coach. Sorry, I cut you off before.
No.
You forgot what you were going to say.
So no, I got it back. Believe it or not, I've forgotten things that I was going to say in this podcast.
What?
The criticism of Towns, and I think of Britt when I think of this, is that in the offseason or coming into the season on media day, he'll always give this generic, well, I just improved my all-around game. And in some ways that is not really taking blame or credit for anything he's really doing well, and more just saying kind of, if I improve, the team should get better. And that's maybe a fair thing to say early in his career when the team was not very good, when a team like him really, or a player like him really belongs in the playoffs with a good team around him. Now that they've been through the playoffs, he's kind of hit some sort of wall, or it appears to have in the first 4 games. Do you think, A, he gets more specific in terms of what he works on in order to counter what D'Antoni did against him? And B, do you think it ever comes up that, hey, I sat down with Tibbs, or I need to have this connection with my coach if I'm going to reach my potential?
I think that's what it is. It's about developing that basketball IQ. It's about further learning the game. It's about further learning the Timberwolves system. I don't think that's exclusively on Towns. I remember talking to him like literally a year ago at this time, and he's like, yeah, Tibbs is staying in Minnesota. I'm going to be around here this summer, and I'm going to travel a little bit, but I'm going to be here so I can be in the office with Tibbs and learning and all this and that. And, I think we all believed that to some degree. That made sense. We saw Towns as someone who wanted to improve, and I think he does. But I don't know if that happened or not. Maybe they were in the office every day over the summer, but really now when we look back at the 12 months that have transpired since then, and very little shows that work happened, or even if that work happened, anything came from it, because largely many of the defensive issues were prevalent with Towns specifically from a year ago to now, and just the general disconnect that seems to be there between the two of them still seems to be there. And I think both of them are kind of tough, interesting, personalities, and that's humans, right? Like, certain people connect better with other people, and what I think has happened in the first 2 years of the Thibodeau system is there hasn't been synergy personality-wise between Tibbs and Cat.
I have a somewhat of a joke question. So
This is exciting.
When Glen Taylor and Karl Anthony Towns have to have their meeting before they sign their max contract, what is Glen Taylor going to ask Karl Anthony Towns to do better before he gives him all of his money? Is it just going to be play better like it was with Andrew?
Well, with Andrew, it was...
What was the quote?
Like, I need to know that you're dedicated or whatever.
Yeah,
something like that.
Which was a fair question.
Yep. Still.
Also, we learned Andrew Wiggins is dedicated when it matters.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Playoffs.
Because that's like the unifying factor. Like, obviously, like Towns and Tibbs have their relationship. The overarching thing over both of them that both of them have to have conversations with is Glen Taylor. So whatever the disconnect is, like if there is a disconnect,
I mean, where Towns is right now, even though we've just been kind of bagging on him a little bit, compared to where Andrew Wiggins was a year ago, is like light years ahead.
Towns just made the All-Star team, for God's sake.
Yeah, right. And I mean, even with Andrew Wiggins, that contract's something I have a lot of personal frustration with, and didn't totally agree with. But that's what happens with first overall picks, unless they become Anthony Bennett. Is you get extended by the team you're on. It's the team that can give you the most money. The team's to some degree kind of over the barrel to keep you. So with Karl Anthony Towns, who despite our bagging on him, is an elite player, one of the best centers, even if he is not in Joel Embiid and Anthony Davis's class. That's money that's gone. The question is Andrew Wiggins and Towns together and Jimmy Butler, is that going to be enough? Because there's your salary cap
and
filled up.
I would love to listen in on, we're talking about meetings with Glen Taylor. I'd love to hear the dialogue between Glen Taylor and Tom Thibodeau at the end of the year. I wonder how that would go.
So I think Tibbs.
You don't know where it would go?
With Glen Taylor, no. I think
Glenn
I know.
had some quotes
I think I know
yesterday.
what Tom Thibodeau would say, but I don't know where Glen Taylor's head is at. I've seen his quotes in the media, but that doesn't necessarily mean one thing or the other.
I'm curious what you have to say, because I think he. Feel free to argue with me. I think Tibbs bought himself a lot of room by beating Denver to get in the playoffs and then winning one game dramatically.
100% agree.
The first game in 14 years, first playoff game in 14 years. I think he bought himself a lot of leash there.
Yeah, I guess I think so too. And I was in the boat that I didn't think he was that Tibbs was gonna get fired. And then all those comments came out after game 2. And then Tibbs comes out and the Wolves have a huge game in game 3, break the streak, blah, blah, blah. So I still don't think he's going to get fired. I still think it's pretty safe assumption that those two are not seeing eye to eye, and there is not synergy between the president of basketball operations and the team's owner.
No, that I agree with, which is, again, why I would love to hear the conversation, because I don't know, how important was that Denver win and how important was that Game 3 win in terms of Glenn's just overall view of him right now?
Here's a couple things.
Past saving the job, just in terms
They're not
of
very
relations.
happy with each other.
I would assume that too. But again, to what degree?
What is
question.
Tibbs' beef with Glen Taylor, though?
I mean, that to come out with those comments after game 2, I mean,
I think it's fair to criticize him after how bad that game was.
So before Game 4
but
started,
you signed him for a 5-year contract.
I know, it's true, and you have $24 million left on it. I think there's a couple factors here. How much merchandise is sold, how many season tickets are sold, and kind of Glenn's going to look at the ratings, right? Which we know are pretty good on Fox Sports North. So he's going to say, did you revitalize, did you make the Wolves relevant again, which was important. I think it's a more substantive conversation in terms of it's not just kind of this baseless my philosophy yours or whatever. It's going to be, I'm sure Glenn's going to say, what are we doing with Jang? I mean, I think guys like Trevor Ariza and Ryan Anderson and some of these other guys on Houston are difference makers that Tibbs needs to acquire. I know not those specific players, but players like that in the future, right? And I'm sure they're going to go, well, how does this work? How does this work with Butler potentially getting this big deal, with now he has an ankle and a knee and back issues and all that, and then Wiggins and Towns.
Yeah.
And at some point, Tibbs is also going to say, well, okay, I mean, in some ways, this offseason is a proving ground where let me do some smart things here under the constraints we have. But going forward, we're going to need to go on the luxury tax. And then Glenn's going to go, I need to have all my season tickets sold. I need to be making money on the team. People have to be wearing the merchandise in the streets and stuff like that.
And before Game 4, Ricardo actually asked a question about are you
exactly where I was
are you enjoying the moment essentially to Tibbs, or are you obviously you're invested in what you're doing, but are you enjoying the moment being in the playoffs? And Tom Thibodeau more or less said, were you pulling up the quote?
Yeah, I was trying to find it.
He more or less said if you have a team that has 14 straight years of not making the playoffs, something is clearly
dramatically
wrong
with the franchise.
And he was basically patting himself on the back. It felt like he may have not done it intentionally, but
what is the one thing that has been there for the past 14 years? Glen Taylor.
Yeah, it felt like a response to the quotes in the Mankato Free Press. To me,
yes.
Maybe it was unintentional. But
I guess this is,
and that's what I meant when I was looking at you, because I don't want to say Glen Taylor and Tom Thibodeau are feuding, because I don't know that.
Again,
but there is a lot of implicit information out there.
I think that's,
and I totally agree. All I'm saying again is I would love to know how Glenn feels after the Game 3 win and after the Denver win. That's all I'm saying, because I have no idea.
And we've got one of those, actually, because he was on WCCO yesterday. was asked by Chet Hartman about the Denver game, if he would have made some management changes had the Wolves not beaten Denver in overtime in the season finally reached the playoffs. Taylor paused and said, "We made the playoffs. That will be my answer. Thank goodness we made the playoffs."
Ooh, I did not see that.
Okay, I'm gonna go this direction, and I think this is something I'm gonna just
Grenade! No,
Yeah, it's not quite the grenade just yet.
Rose.
Give Rose $100 million. No,
Ways to get Tom Thibodeau fired.
yeah,
I just threw up a little. Sorry.
it gives him part of the team, but anyway, I'm
Assistant
sorry.
head coach Derrick Rose.
I'm not. Yeah, I'm not being serious. No,
But
but
he's going to fire Layden and hire Rose instead.
What do you got, Tom?
God damn it. I'm going to write something about this at the end of the year. Changing the culture is really hard. I think it's fair for Tibbs. I don't think he should lean on it too hard, but it's fair for him to say, look, this is Browns level bad. Like how the Wolves have played and just how the organization's been run and stuff for years. Flip tried to revitalize it. We know what happened there, but outside of that, the whole Khan thing, I mean, we don't need to rehash all of it, but you were expected to lose in Minnesota. Like that's that, and I don't think players would want to come here, period. Not because it's cold, but because it's a losing franchise. And I think to turn it around, I know he had the hiccup the first year, but he should get some credit for that. And I think we should at least allow some leeway for the offseason and then for him to try to max out the talent the next year.
That's like okay, I hear that, and that's all like, that makes sense in like theory, but I think given the fact that you have this young and talented core and a potential Hall of Famer on your team, you are taking a risk by saying, I think Tom Thibodeau is taking the right steps, but you are taking a risk if part of you believes that Tom Thibodeau is not the man for the job to get this team to the promised land. And if that is your belief and you have parsed through all the data and everything that you know as Glen Taylor, and it's more than a 50% chance in your mind that he is not the guy, it's not worth waiting another year to figure that out. I mean, if the goal is a championship, getting to the promised land, whatever we want to call that, if Tom Thibodeau is a slow progression that doesn't get you as far as you want to go, then
I just want to use this as an. Do you have a point?
Well, no, I was going to say I think I'm on board with what you're saying. I think Tom Thibodeau can make a really, really strong case if he walks into Glen Taylor's office and says, people doubted me about Taj Gibson. Taj Gibson was awesome this year. People doubted me about Derrick Rose. Derrick Rose has been a key factor in the playoffs. People thought that we were done when this death stretch came and Jimmy Butler got hurt. We still made the playoffs. People thought we were going to get swept by Houston. We had one big game against Houston. We won 47 games. We were supposed to make the playoffs. We made the playoffs even with Jimmy Butler missing 20-plus games.
Okay.
I think
mock negotiation.
Again,
I know I'm not trying to make you wrong here.
Okay, sure.
You're just pointing out what Tibbs would say.
I'm saying, yeah, exactly.
Okay, but even to those things that are all true and went well, there's an argument to be made that Taj Gibson is the exact wrong type of power forward to put next to Karl-Anthony Towns. Totally. Despite how much we all love what Taj was, what he gave to this team, energy-wise perspective. Derrick Rose, you bring in Derrick Rose, yes, and he has been huge in this series. Mm-hmm. Honestly, one of the most consistent players in it, and important. But Derrick Rose is 29, injury history. He could be phasing Tyus Jones out of the equation in Minnesota, who's 8 years younger than him. And this could end up being a peril win for that situation specifically. So those moves might be right in the moment. But I don't know if in the big picture, Taj Gibson or Derrick Rose were necessarily great moves. And then to the playoff series, then that's where my whole point comes is a 5-game playoff series where you broke the streak and all that. Is that necessarily the best thing for the big picture of the organization, which I've said for a million times that you miss the playoffs and you have 2 first-round picks and you can change.
If you're Glen Taylor, that last point would not come up. That's one thing I'd say. And the other thing I'd say is, if I'm Tom Thibodeau and you bring up Taj Gibson isn't the right power forward for the team, which I agree with.
Yeah.
Tim, not Tom.
Yeah.
Thibodeau, not you. Anyway, I think Tom Thibodeau would argue, okay, Taj Gibson wasn't the right power forward for this team. Who did you want? Who was out there that you wanted? I mean, Patrick
And
Patterson.
I think he also can
Jermichael
say-
Green. I mean, there aren't a lot of great options out there.
And patience was an option, but patience was an option, and putting that.
But
just patience
how
becomes
much
less of an option when you've lost as much.
exactly?
As the Wolves had.
If playoffs are
Then that's subjective.
if playoffs are the priority, then patience is less.
And that's what the whole question in all this is I don't understand what the mandate of playoffs was. And I know everyone's like, it's been 14 years, but what is the goal? Is the goal to make the playoffs this year, or is the goal to take Karl Anthony Towns and Andrew Wiggins to become a champion 5 years from now?
But I think culture and winning culture is part of that, especially if you want them to stay and not get to a point where
it's absolutely part of it. It's absolutely part of it. I'm just saying it's just simply because the team hasn't made the playoffs for 14 years does not mean that going out and getting Jeff Teague, Taj Gibson, Derrick Rose, Jamal Crawford is right because it increases their odds of making the playoffs this year. In my opinion, it's about what is not this window, what it is the next window. That's what's more important.
Fair. I think we would know more next year, and that's, I guess, why I'm saying literally a year leeway makes sense. But go ahead.
If you have Jimmy Butler on your team,
Which is what we haven't said yet because
if
we
you have
talked
Jimmy
about everybody
Butler
else.
on your team and you miss the playoffs and you don't go make more moves for more winning type players, you probably don't keep him. That's probably which we've also talked about. Maybe
but what
not
if they
the
got
worst
Jimmy
thing.
Butler and didn't get Taj Gibson and Jeff Teague and those guys?
Sure.
What if they got Jimmy Butler and surrounded him in a way that did not financially strap them as much as they did?
That would be great.
And were types of players that played better into Andrew Wiggins' strengths and Karl Anthony Towns' strengths.
That is an argument you can absolutely make. But again, I think Tom Thibodeau could say who is out there to go get.
And I think they
for the price of Jeff Teague, you could have got C.J. Miles and Darren Collison. C.J. Miles shot over 40% from three, and Darren Collison led the league in three-point shooting at 47%. Who are two players who are crucial role players for two of the best teams in the Eastern Conference right now.
It's a good point.
If we're really gonna do this,
I mean, there's a million different things. There are answers.
But they may not have wanted to come here, and Jeff Teague did. I think that's part of it too.
C.J. Miles did.
Okay.
C.J. Miles definitely did.
if we're gonna call it I'm gonna drop the R bomb. If we're gonna call out names of players that are severely influencing
the man bun beard man,
teams that are playing as well as any team in the playoffs right now, Ricky Rubio is leading the Utah Jazz to a probable series win over the Oklahoma City Thunder while shooting as well as he ever has and still being Ricky Rubio in every other aspect.
So you can make
that man was on your team.
You can make the
Cheaper than
case.
Teague.
You can absolutely make the case that guys like Collison or Miles or Rubio would have been more financially workable, I guess, for the future, and they still could have competed. I guess Tom Thibodeau probably felt the pressure to make the playoffs, which I hear what you're saying. I totally hear what you're saying. But if they don't make the playoffs, if they go get a Darren Collison and a C.J. Miles, and it doesn't work to the same effect as a Taj Gibson or a Jeff Teague worked here, and you miss the playoffs, A, I don't think Tom Thibodeau sticks around, and B, I don't think Jimmy Butler sticks around.
I was going to say, because
What if it's better? What if it was better?
It might have been, but what's Tom Thibodeau thinking about? I mean, he's he's got to make the playoffs.
I was going to say,
and also go ahead.
If you walk into this season and make we questioned both the Teague and the Taj signings when we entered the season, so let's not backtrack that far. Everybody had questions about those. We've talked at length about how both players have exceeded those expectations relatively greatly while still having the contracts that they have. Mm-hmm. When you make the trade for Jimmy Butler with 2 years left on his contract, if you sign a roster that is not immediately targeted at making the playoffs that season, you are betting everything you have on selling him in 1 year, which is...
They tried that with Kevin Love to a certain degree, and that didn't work at all. They had less to work with.
There's another whole elephant in the room here of Jimmy Butler signing a max contract and staying here is not necessarily a good thing. And I know that sounds like blasphemy to a lot of people because Jimmy Butler is the heart and the soul of this team. But you need to understand the financial element of the game and roster construction. And given the fact that you have Andrew Wiggins, Karl Anthony Towns, that is $100 million to three players, and that doesn't matter. Yes, Glen Taylor is writing the checks, but you literally cannot put anyone else around them if that is the case. And Jimmy Butler We have seen it is fair to assert that guy has a body that is not at the age of a normal 29-year-old. And to sign him to a 4-year max contract, that you're taking him a ways down the road.
I don't disagree at all.
So let's.
Yeah, I also don't disagree. I just hadn't hit it. Thank you for
Let me
saying
just
it.
drop this. Like, the one thing between Taylor and Tibbs is that if Glen Taylor signs Tibbs up, he had to know that he was bringing in his own guys and going to create his own culture and all that. Like, at some point, you got to kind of know what you're getting.
The
with
moves
Tibbs.
reflect the direction Glen Taylor wanted to take. They wanted to get to the playoffs as quickly as possible.
So let me go
For better or for worse.
Yep, no, that's a good point.
So let me use the Warriors just as a brief example here, because that was a team that was a laughingstock, right? If you take away that one, we believe or whatever year in 07-08 when they beat, or no, that's 06-07 when they beat Dallas. You had to go back to 94-95 when they made the playoffs, right? So Simmons writes this How to Annoy a Fan Base in 60 Steps, all that. That was after Mark Jackson's first year when they won 23 games. They win 47 the next year. They win 51 the next year. Jackson's gone. They win the finals, and you have Kerr, right? I think there's some comparables. Are there not? There's some comparables between Tibbs and Jackson in the sense that Jackson
they're guys who understand basketball as if it's 2004.
Well, my point is that Tibbs would be in the second year, right? So the first year would be like Jackson's first year when he won 23 games. The second year would be when they won the playoffs. The third year, you could see Tibbs going, the Wolves going 51-31 next year, right? That's not out of the realm of possibility.
Yep.
And I think then, instead of asking the get to the playoffs question, the create some sort of culture that gets there, get the fan base involved and all that, I think then the question goes to, is this a sustainable culture for the foreseeable future? And the issue is going back to Butler. You've already traded Levine. You could probably use marketing and Dunn for Butler. In some ways, you can't just eject him because of what you traded for him. And there's different complications than the Warriors had. But at the end of the day, I think we have to think about it through that frame of mind. I think the third year is happening. I think it should. I think more questions surround the fourth and ultimately the fifth year.
But don't you believe? Isn't what you're saying is you believe that getting to Steve Kerr is what made the Warriors who the Warriors
and
are?
Maybe you need someone else after Tibbs. I mean, what I'm saying is, like, I think we're jumping in conclusions after 2 years, and I think we'll know instrumentally more after 3. And I really, to be honest,
if the culture's poisoned, the culture's poisoned. Get out of the water. I mean, I don't know, but I'm. That's from where I'm sitting. I'm not where Glen Taylor have the amount of access that he does, nor do I know the extent of where the players are. But if this is where we're sitting and we're thinking that this culture isn't right and that for the Wolves to become the Warriors, which is the goal, as high of a goal as that is,
that's the goal. Yeah,
it required moving to Steve Kerr. That team could not have been what it is without Mark Jackson. If that's true, I think it's a pretty strong argument to move on from Tibbs sooner rather than later.
To loop back to where we started this podcast, it appears that Houston has found their culture and their coach that fits them, that has turned them into a championship contender.
Yep.
And we spent a decent chunk of this podcast talking about all the interconnectedness between Morey and between D'Antoni and between the players in that roster, and trust in the system, trust in that what they're doing is the right thing, even when it doesn't work, even in games like Game 3 for them. It does not feel like at any point in Tom Thibodeau's tenure to this point there has been that a 100% belief and buy-in from everybody top to bottom. At that point, like, it isn't necessarily a statement of is Tom Thibodeau a good coach or a bad coach. Is a statement of is he the right fit for this team, for these players, for this culture.
So the argument for making the playoffs right away is that post Tibbs, whenever that is, right? If you're in the playoffs, if you
after Tibbs,
if you're in the playoffs, if you have Wiggins and Towns, you can get a better coach and better free agents than you could have pre-Tibbs. I believe hands down.
Yeah, maybe.
And I think that's important for whatever's next.
I agree, but how much better is a big question because
I don't think anyone was coming here. And
you're right, and now some people will.
Yeah, I think you can make the case that if they trade for Jimmy Butler and just flop and miss the playoffs, that looks bad to free agents.
Yep.
I think that's a fair thing to say.
I will also say that,
But they also don't have much money to sign free agents.
right, part of Tibbs. Part of it is he brought in Jimmy Butler, which attracts guys like Teague, Gibson, and Crawford, which we just went through. Maybe not the best things. But part of the attraction in the eyes of Taj and Jeff Teague and Jamal, and they've all said this on the record, was Karl Anthony Towns and Andrew Wiggins, and a belief in those two players that they only have further belief in now after playing with them. So, to counter your point, Tom, is that I think Karl Anthony Towns being this player, because I think he would have developed into this player with any coach,
Sure.
right?
Yep.
I mean,
Yep.
close to 98% of it. That would have attracted some free agents too, because
Sure.
I mean, dude, look at Philadelphia. Look at the Sixers right now. You don't think that team was diseased?
Well, you can even say
that's
you
fair.
can even say that Karl Anthony Towns attracted Tibbs, who was a hot coaching commodity.
That's fair. I think the flip side of that is if Towns really didn't believe he could win here, if he felt like he was on the Browns, he might go, guys, I'm not going to,
Never happened before, though. That's never happened before.
What do you mean?
That a guy has been drafted by his team in this era where you to be re-signed in this restricted free agency market. I mean, the closest thing to that has ever happened is Greg Monroe.
But
with
he
Detroit.
could have
they don't leave.
He could have signed that deal and then demanded a trade.
the only way they leave is
Okay,
when they're
true,
yeah.
but that's still a few years down the road. It wouldn't have been his rookie contract and
Fair.
peace out. It's
Fair.
I came up with a Bill Simmons not a pipe dream scenario. Well, I'll say it off the pod. I don't want to say it on the record. Never mind. Should I wrap it up?
We should wrap it up. We have a
Okay.
meeting now.
We have a meeting, a zone coverage staff meeting coming up. So that's not going to be on the podcast network, though. So we got to wrap it up. Game 5 is on Wednesday in Houston. So until then, for David Naylor at Prop Cedar, Tom Schreier at TSchreier3, Dane Moore at Dane Moore NBA. I'm Tim Faklis at TIMFAKLIS. This has been another Wolves Wired. We'll see you next time.